But it's good to be with you this week. We are going to be talking tonight, we're going to be looking at the age of the earth and just how old is the earth anyway. Now there's a lot of discussion about the age of the earth, and is it important? We're going to look at the age of the earth as a scientist, and then we're going to see if it's important. The Bible starts out, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. When was the beginning? If God created it in the beginning, then when was the beginning? Was it 20 billion years ago? Was it 10,000 years ago? Was it 6,000 years ago? We're going to look at that this evening. Here's our two timelines, the two basic timelines. Now at the top here we have the creationist timeline. It says about 6,000 years ago God created everything. Then about 4,400 years ago there was a great flood. Thank you. And then about 2,000 years ago we have the birth of Christ, and right on up till today. Now that's a long time. Evolution's timeline says about 20 billion years ago there was a Big Bang. How many heard of the Big Bang before? Most of you have, good. Now then it says about 4.6 billion years ago Earth was founded, Earth formed, and then about 3 billion years ago the first life form. Then we have about 2 million years ago man evolved, and then we're right up till today. Now that's a lot different timelines here. Time is like God to the theory of evolution. See, we believe with God all things are possible. To an evolutionist, with time all things are possible. Time will work miracles, and we believe God works miracles. They believe that time works miracles. If you just give it enough time, it could happen. Anything could if you just give it enough time. So time becomes like God to the theory of evolution. Now, 6,000 years, some people think that we have a very old earth. I think we have a very young looking earth. But you go back 6,000 years. Now, if you go back 100 years, now that's a long time. I've covered a little over half of that, but that's a long time. A lot can happen in 100 years. Now, if you go back just 5 times 100 years, you're back to about the time that Christopher Columbus discovered America. Now, that's a long time ago. You go back about 20 times 100 years, now you're back to about the time of the birth of Christ, and that's a long, long time. If you go back 44 times 100 years, now you're back to about the time of a great flood. Now I was raised up in the Thumb area of Michigan, and I went back to the farm I was raised on like 25 years later, and I couldn't hardly recognize anything. It had changed so much in 25 years, I couldn't even find anything. You know, it had changed so much. But man, think about how much could change if you went, I mean, this is only 25 years. Think if you went back 4,400 years, how much could change. Now, if you go back 60 times 100 years, now you're back to about the time that God created everything, about 6,000 years ago. That's a long time. Now, evolution says about 20 billion years ago, there was a Big Bang. If you were to take this top timeline and put it down here to the same scale as this one. Now I made these to different scales. I have this timeline right here next to me, this chart. This one up here, see, is 6 inches equal 1,000 years. Now down here we have 2 inches equal 1 billion years. That's a little bit different scale. If you were to take the top one and make it to the same scale as the bottom one, that top timeline would be thinner than a piece of paper, and you wouldn't even notice it on this bottom timeline. That's how small that time period seems, 6,000 years. Now, if you were to take the bottom timeline, the 20 billion years, and you made it to the same scale as the top one, this bottom timeline here would be 1,893 miles long. Now, I didn't want to carry a chart that big, okay? So we used a little bit different scale tonight. Now, once upon a time, long ago and far away, a beautiful princess kissed a frog, and that frog turned into a handsome prince. Now, we know that's a fairy tale, don't we? How many ladies here tonight got your husband by kissing a frog? Anybody at all? Okay, I don't see any hands. All right, good. Normally, I get 1 or 2 that raise their hand. A couple weeks ago, I did a seminar, and 2 ladies raised their hand. When that happens, I say, ma'am, I think you misunderstood the question, okay? I didn't ask how many of you kissed a prince and he turned into an old toad. Okay, now that happens sometimes. This is something different than that, all right? This one doesn't happen. Now, today they tell a very different fairy tale. Today they say that, by the way, this is a fairy tale, okay, boys and girls? You young ladies, do not go looking for frogs this spring, okay? This is just a fairy tale. It doesn't work that way. But today they tell a very different fairy tale. Today they say, once upon a time, long ago and far away, there was a frog. And if you just give that frog enough time, he'll turn into a prince all by himself. You don't even have to kiss him. The magic ingredient is no longer a magic kiss. It's millions of years of time. Just give it hundreds of millions of years. And that frog will turn into a prince very slowly. Now see, this is their line of thinking. If a frog turns into a prince quickly, that's a fairy tale. But if that frog turns into a prince slowly, that's science. Still seems like a fairy tale to me, but the process is very slow, but you can see it beginning to happen already. He's turning into a prince right before your eyes. Now, how many here have heard of horsehair worms before? Anybody at all heard of horsehair worms? Don't see any hands, okay. I was raised up in the, okay, I do see one hand. I was raised up in the Thumb area of Michigan and raised on a farm. One day when I was 6 years old, well actually I was 6 that whole year, but one day when I was 6 anyway, I was walking down this back drive, and here it says that horsehair worms, it says horsehair once thought to have formed from horsehairs that dropped into drinking troughs. Now I was going down this back road and they had some water that had been sitting there, this hard gravel there for a couple weeks, and you know how water sits and gets stagnant and you get these little wiggly things in it? Well, there was this long black skinny wiggly thing swimming around there, and I said, Dad, what's this long black skinny wiggly thing here? So, well, son, they say that's a horsehair worm. They say that, you ever notice how they start out with that? They say, I don't know who they was. I want to ask they some questions, but I didn't know who they was, couldn't find out. But they say, I think it was an old husband's tale or something, they say that if a horsehair drops into the water, it'll come to life and start swimming around after a few days. Now, this is very popular in scientific fields, you know, how life coming from non-life, we talked about that last week, and how you have this horsehair that once it falls from the horse, it's not growing anymore, but somehow it turns into a little bug and it swims around. Life from non-life, and they already proved that wrong. But see, when you're 6 years old, and you have somebody tell you something like that you trust, you know, like your parents or your brothers, or, well, maybe not your brothers, but your parents or maybe your teachers. You know, when you're 6 years old, you're probably going to believe it. See, but it was from somebody I trusted, and it had an element of truth to it. It did look like probably what a horsehair would look like, and I don't know, but, and I know we didn't have horses on the farm at that time, but I knew at one time we did, so it could be some loose hairs floating around somewhere. So it had an element of truth to it, and I was only 6 years old. And so I believed it. But when you're 6 years old and you have thoughts of one day raising horsehairs for fun and profit, you're probably going to be in for a letdown somewhere down the line here, okay? Now, Adolf Hitler said if you tell a lie long enough and loud enough and often enough, the people will believe it. And it worked for him over in Germany because he told them over there the Jews were nothing more than animals. They hadn't evolved as far as the Germans, so it was okay to kill them. And they believed him. They swallowed it. Here it is. This is a teacher's annotated textbook. Teacher's edition, stressed that the earth is thought to be at least 4.5 billion years old. Now, why is that important? Because if you don't get the kids believing it's billions of years old, you know, it says, starts out with telling them something about millions of something, and then switch to that, going to billions of things, you know. And I mentioned last week, I think I mentioned this, if you don't understand what a billion is, don't worry about it, because Congress has no idea either, okay? So it's probably not that important, but why is that important? Because they need billions of years or evolution won't happen, so they got to have it. So you know, even some Christians believe this billions of years stuff. Dr. Hugh Ross, I don't know if any of you heard of him, but he has a group out in California called Reasons to Believe. Now, I've written to him on a number of occasions. He won't answer my letters, but I read one of his books, and see, he calls himself a progressive creationist. He believes as some things started dying out, God just made some new ones. He created some new ones, and then at the right time, you'll put man on the scene. Although he somehow believes that Neanderthals were one of our ancestors, but he didn't have a soul yet, so that was okay. But he says there was billions of years, so I wrote to him. A friend of mine gave me one of his books to read, so I read that, and I found about 16 things wrong with it, scripturally and scientifically, so I wrote him a letter. And one of his assistants, Dr. Connolly, wrote back and said, Dr. Ross intently read your letter, and then he said, if you will get his book, Creation and Time, it will answer all of your questions.